So let me start off with a few initial impressions. I guess I can no longer claim to be new here. Yeah, the honeymoon is over, right? But just a few thoughts. You know, NRC's reputation as producing high-quality work and as a top workplace is very well deserved. I've really been struck by the drive that the staff has to the mission, the dedication and the commitment you all share to the mission of the agency. It's been very impressive to me. And I do again want to thank you for all the hard work that you do, most recently demonstrated with Hurricane Sandy. You all put in over 100% effort, and I really appreciate that. I come here as a scientist, a writer, and a professor, and these background experiences certainly shape the approach I take to the job. I am trained to identify, to explore, to understand the full range of data about an issue before I draw conclusions. And I have to defend the interpretations that I make. This is a business not for the thin-skinned, and in doing so, I'm obligated to ask tough questions, to challenge assumptions, to challenge the conventional wisdom in the search for knowledge. And in doing so, it's important to keep an open mind as well. Let me say a few things about openness, collaboration, and effective communication. I'm committed to this value of the open collaborative work environment. And for those of you who don't know, I do maintain an open door policy. I am interested in hearing your views, and I'm valuing what you say about your work and how we can improve. So be aware of that. The value of the open collaborative work environment, I think, should permeate our external relations as well. I strongly believe, many of you have heard me talk about this, the need for clear and concise communication. And I believe very strongly that explaining our actions and motivations helps us communicate our mission. We need to communicate transparently and remember that dialogue goes both ways. It's explaining, but also listening.
Please comment on the type of leadership that you support. Command and control leadership versus servant leadership.
Those are my only choices? Neither. Option C. I think it's important to lead by example. I think it's important to also lead by listening and taking into account people's concerns, but also being decisive. These are my views on leadership. I'm sure my colleagues have their own views.
I would say that I do support servant leadership. I believe that true leadership is taking your own ego and agenda and putting it under the agenda and the mission of the organization that you're leading. I actually was invited to talk about some leadership concepts, so I did a little bit of research of my own, but then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates gave, I thought, a wonderful speech. I think it was one of the last he spoke at the service academies right before he resigned as Secretary of Defense. This one might have been in Annapolis, I'm not sure of that, but he said something that I'll always remember. He said, you should judge a leader by how they treat the people that can't talk back to them. So that's really a key leadership element. So I would say of those two choices, I think I gravitate towards servant leadership.
My view of leadership is that the purpose of leadership is to enable people that are in your organization to provide their best efforts and to enable them to give their creativity, their energy, their passion, and help them direct that in the right way. You can't do that with simply a command and control approach, but sometimes command and control is part of the picture. And I think true leadership is knowing when to be the servant leader and when to be the command and control leader, and to balance those roles as you go on a day-to-day basis.
I have a lot of agreement here with my colleagues. I guess I don't see leadership as being in this category or that category. I think a leader has to adapt his or her style somewhat based on the circumstances, the role he or she may be in. Irrespective of what style somebody chooses to employ, I think it's imperative that he or she communicate their vision for how they see themselves as a leader interacting with the people that work for them. And I believe that that communication, typically I'll use the phrase down the chain of command in most organizations so that people understand where somebody is coming from, that can be very helpful. One, to help that leader frame his or her perspectives, and two, to help the people that are working for that person understand where that person is coming from.
Could you share your thoughts on the NRC's relationship with interveners? What is your vision for this relationship?
People have asked me, what was your biggest surprise coming to the agency? And I have to say, my biggest surprise was understanding what the resident inspectors do and folks at the regional offices, and understanding how committed they are, how independent they are from the licensee. And I don't think that we have done a good enough job getting that message out. I think it's very important that we do get that message out, and I think it's very important that we do interact with interveners. It's incumbent upon us as a government agency to communicate clearly, but also to really listen to their concerns and hear them. Doesn't mean we have to act on them, but if we show that we hear them, I think we move ourselves along and we gain their trust. And it's really important to gain their trust.
I agree with your comments on that. I think one thing I would add is that there are clearly interveners that, and I'll use this word, ideologically disagree with the fundamental aspect of our job, which is overseeing the operation of nuclear power plants, because they don't think nuclear power plants should operate. So obviously, on that fundamental point, there's not going to be a great deal of room for common understanding and agreement. However, these people also would like the plants, insofar they do operate, to be safe. So often, that is a place where you can have the conversation. If they are pointing out things or raising issues that honestly have safety implications, there's no reason not to have those conversations, and I encourage that we do.
Yeah, I think it's important to bear in mind that when you judge others, you are judged yourself. So if I have an intervener who finds everything we do wrong and outrageous, that tells me something about that intervener. But on the other hand, there are some groups and individuals out there who, when we do something right, they say so, and then they point out areas where, in their opinion, we could do better. Then you really pay more attention.
It's so important for us to talk about, as a regulator, what are we doing and why in the space of regulation. And oftentimes we do that very diligently in response to incoming questions. We always do it, quite frankly, in response to incoming questions, and our staff does it, they do a great job with that. But trying to bridge from that model to perhaps a more proactive strategic engagement on an ongoing basis is more difficult.
To each commissioner, can you identify one or two issues for the coming year that you feel passionate about?
I feel we've got a lot of stuff in front of us. I think I have the energy for all of it.
I think there's a host of issues that really, I think, could change the way we think about regulating nuclear plants in the United States. So those are very important issues. So that's one issue I would point to. Another is something where I think Chairman McFarland is already taking some leadership in the short time she's been with us, and that is, how we interact with the public. I think this is something Commissioner Osdorf and I actually have talked about this a lot during our tenure. I think there's real opportunities to look at how we interact with the public, both in terms of just communications and also in terms of adjudicatory space. And I think there's an opportunity to take a close look at that to see if we can do more to be a better public servant.
But I think in the regulatory framework issues post-Fukushima, in near-term task force recommendation 1, in the economic consequences and the filter event recommendations, in the prioritization and disposition of other Tier 2, Tier 3 activities, how do we end up making sure that when all is done here and all these decisions are made, that we have a coherent regulatory framework that has a foundation that passes a common sense test? And that is much easier said than done. We're blessed to have a staff that's working very hard on this day in and day out. But I think it's important for us also to be able to make these individual decisions, yet also step back and take a 100,000-foot view of the landscape and see, does this all make sense? Is there a coherent philosophical underpinning to what we've decided?
Yeah, I'd like to add something. I don't know if it's passionate, but one issue that has started to occupy me a lot is the question, the high-level question, whether there is a hole in our regulations. We are all so busy working on the current issues, the issues of the day, and various SECI papers and so on, that maybe there is something somewhere that we should have done and we haven't done it. I don't know what that is, or that would be, or even if there is a hole. But that really worries me, because I am convinced that once we have identified an issue as a community, which includes us and the industry, we're doing a very good job. Once the issue has been identified, we are doing a very good job. So it's really the completeness issue once again. Are our regulations complete in the sense that they cover all possible challenges?
I'm going to pick 3 passionate issues, or issues that I'm passionate about. Of course, the Fukushima follow-on, and in particular there, I'm really interested in the intersection of natural hazards and effective nuclear regulation. I know a number of you have heard me talk about geology and effective nuclear regulation, but I think the flooding issue and a number of these other issues are really, should be front and center. We need to be proactive in understanding how the Earth is changing and not be caught out by it. Of course, I'm always eternally passionate about the back end of the fuel cycle, so I'm really interested in what happens with and how we approach the waste confidence decision. And then finally, like Commissioner Magwood, I think communication is very important, both internal and external, and I'm focused on that in particular, and external engagement, but also how we communicate internally. So I think it was a good session. I do appreciate all your questions.